Hello. In honor of Black History Month, we're here today at the Ruby and Calvin Fletcher African American History Museum. And I'm here with their son Jeffrey, and I'd like to understand what was your journey in opening this, and it's Connecticut's first African American History Museum?
Yes, hello, Senator, and I'm glad to be here. The journey started probably 2 years after the passing of both my parents. And I realized that my mom had a collection that told her story of her childhood and my dad's childhood living in Jim Crow South at a young age. This museum is a chronological journey that starts at the continent of Africa, and we take small steps through various points in African American history. So in this space here, it's the beginning of the journey to America and where it all started. So we start from the continent of Africa, and as we know, Africa is a huge continent and has many states, but tribes as well as villages. And so the pieces that are in here in this space is actually, we are in Africa. And the pieces represent Africa. We'll see the mahogany carved statues. We'll see the ceremonial headdress, the elk and shield, warrior shield, and the drums as well. And so this is the beginning of the journey. And when you go through this museum, I will have, as I said, segments of African American history. Because of space, we chose the different things that were representative of the beginnings and to where we might be today. And as we left Africa, we boarded the hull of a slave ship. And what I've done in this space was to recreate that, because I want to give people a sense of being inside of a space that is very closed, somewhat dark, and we also have audio in here. So as we look in this room, we're standing on planks from a ship. They're not a slave ship, but they're a ship from the 1860. And if you look behind me, we have the continent of Africa. And what's very striking, these aren't miles that we see numbers here. Those are souls that came from Africa. And the part of what we're looking here is the flow of how the ships went. And if you look over my right shoulder, we can see where most of these souls were taken, which was into the Caribbean. And the reason why, because sugar cane, rum, molasses was all being, it was import-exporting, and it went throughout the world. And if you look at the transition of coming to America, those numbers aren't as high as here. And Brazil was one of the leading ports that individuals were dropped off, and some never left Brazil. So this, I try to give people the sense that you're immersed into the scene, you're immersed into the history, as opposed to looking on the outside through a glass or a stanchion. I want people to be in the scene. And it's pretty impactful. And it's one of our most difficult spaces for people to stand in sometimes.
Yeah, it starts to put things in real numbers. Can you explain a little bit about the disembarkments? That, I think, is also an important part of the story.
Yeah, so there would be sometimes anywhere between 200 to 300 souls on the hulls of these ships. And if you see here, this is the Amistad. And this is the prototype that was used to reconstruct the Amistad that we know today that sails up and down the East Coast. Okay. So now we've left Africa. We just disembarked from a slave ship. And now the ship has pulled into a port somewhere in the United States in the south along the coastline. It could be South Carolina, it could be Georgia, it could be North Carolina, it could be Virginia, right? And so in this space, I want people to see some of the objects, and I call them objects, that were used on plantations. Things in this case, they're very, very difficult things to look at, but I want to make clear that these oppressive instruments and objects that we are looking at right now, they weren't used by plantation owners or people who had control over enslaved people. They were used by people who did not know any better. 2, maybe 3% of slavers or plantation owners used them. And you got to think about the logic here, okay? So if you look at these signage on the walls here, these are the actual documents, but I've made them, enlarged them so people can read them much better. So if you look at these documents and see how much people were being paid, or souls would cost, you got to say to yourself, why would you maim, why would you hurt that property that's supposed to harvest and plant your crop? It was insane. So when I say there was a small group of people or owners that used it, that's what it was. It doesn't make it any better or any worse, but these weren't readily used all the time. And they were used basically to break the spirits of those enslaved individuals that were defiant and did not want to do what the overseer or the person that owned the plantations or the farms that they worked on. Over here to my right, this is one of the interesting things that I like to do is to, as I said, this is a hands-on museum. And what I do is I let people actually hold these objects because I want them to get the feel of the gravity of them, how difficult it was and to be right here with this object. This is about 158 years old, 59 years old. And it's a punishment, oppressive thing. And that was to break the spirit of someone who was out of control.
Right. It really would not allow them to fall asleep. And, these are fairly sharp.
Exactly.
And what about this? What was going on here?
So this was an alarm system. That, to be honest, this was an alarm system. As you can see on this poster here, or this print here, it was an alarm system. And it was, buckshot was in here. So imagine if you were walking around and you had that affixed to your body and you're walking around during the course of a night, or you decide you want to run, this would start rattling. So when we watch these movies of Hollywood and individuals running through swamps and they have dogs chasing them and on horses and things, the dogs, they can only pick up so much scent, right? Because if you're running through the swamp, that scent is getting washed off. Mm-hmm. And so the commonality is we can hear, and whatever direction this individual is going with this on them, it will alert the hunters where they are. Very hard, but I saw children's faces when they came. And again, you got to explain what it is.
Right.
And the actual, I don't clean up anything. What you see is when I get it from auction, it was taken from its origins and delivered to me, or I'm there to pick it up after auction. And it has the provenance of where it came from. It was in the ground. Mm-hmm. And a lot of these objects were buried in the ground to forget about history. And if we think about what's going on in Fallujah and places where ISIS and Al-Qaeda are, what was the things that they did when they went to these villages? They destroyed history. They destroyed manuscripts. They destroyed a lot of history to erase that past of whoever or whatever the culture or the religion or the sect that were living in these communities over there. So we say history sometimes repeats itself, but yes, it repeats itself in other places and regions around the world. And that's how they claim to want to do that. And they did it in Germany with the Jews, where they had Kristallite, where they had bonfires burning intellectual properties and different things of that nature. Right. So these advertisements are like your everyday, if you read the newspaper, but if you still get the newspaper, because everything's online, but when you read the newspaper, there was a section, kind of like the want ads and legal notices, and here it is just the way it was printed. Different sizes of runaway slaves and slaves that decided to walk off the plantation and rewards for slaves. And it was done in 3 languages, English, Spanish, and French, because Louisiana had the Spanish and French culture there as well. So they wanted to make sure that this information got out to every Spanish or French or English-speaking person in the region.
Yeah, but right in with all the other ads, here with like whiskey, bacon, glass, flour, it was just like a part of a sales column.
Yeah, I mean, you got to remember too, the enslaved people were not considered human. They were considered property, and they belonged to property. So when you think about textile, and you think about cotton, you think about pewter, you think about linen and all of that, it fell right in there because that is property. That is really material property that they were considered to be.
And this exhibit definitely shows the dehumanizing effect of what was going on at the time.
Yes, and you're going to hear me throughout this this tour make it abundantly clear that this is not, and I make this clear to everyone, this is not to be pointing fingers and saying it's your fault, it's that fault, because I say this, and I say this only because people can be cruel, and they can look at things to try to blame or put somebody on. You didn't create any of this. Your staff didn't create it, neither did the cameraman. It was a time and a period where this happened. And so rather than to not say it did happen, I want to make sure that people know it did happen. And it has nothing to do with pointing the finger or blaming anybody. And it's a very, very honest discussion. And again, I so appreciate your being here and taking the time to do this seminar. So in this space here, we wanted to make it a soft transition from Africa from the slave ship to now we're getting ready, and from the plantation, now we're getting ready to go into the 19th century because of space, right? So I had to think, along with my staff, how can we transition this? I mean, you just don't jump into something, but we got to transition it. So in this space, I wanted to let people know that, this does look like a cavern of some sort, but it's a holding area for people trying to escape the plantation now,
Right.
and now come into the light, which is the 19th century. Because now 1865 was the Emancipation Proclamation, and so somewhere along the line, the next 5 to 6 years, 10 years, we now have to make that transition to the 19th century. So this space, as I said, we jumped from the 1800s, now we're into the 19th century because of spacing. So I thought it would be appropriate to let's talk about some of the imagery that we see around us and over our heads and so forth. This space deals with stereotype, bias, and unconditional bias, and how people of color are seen, and some of the stereotypes that are used. And I use this space to educate and to say that, that was a time period that people were made fun of. And of course, I don't have a tail. I don't look like some of these characters, and they speak for themselves. But unfortunately, it was part of advertisement to sell goods and products, and we can see some of on the wall. Armor products were used, and Aunt Jemima and other objects were used cigarettes were used to sell, people were used to sell their products. These are interesting figures here, and I try to add levity. I try to have some fun when people come through here, and I don't want to make things so sullen, so dark, and so disconnected. But what I do is with these images, and I ask people where do they think they were made, and everybody thinks they're made somewhere deep in the South. But there was a young white girl yesterday. She must have been about 11 years old. And I said to the students, I said, where do you think these were made? A lot of students, some of the African-American children, they raised their hand. In the South, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi. She raised her hand and she said, New England. And I said, how did you know that? She showed herself, I don't know. And everybody got a kick out of that. And they were made in Cromwell, Connecticut. They were originated in England. And the mold was bought, the cast mold was bought by H.E. Stevens Company out of Carmel, Connecticut. They made metal toys and metal objects, and they made the mold of this. Ironically, this was not only owned by white people, black folks owned these too. To this day, they will come in and say, oh yeah, I remember my grandmother, my great-grandmother having these objects. And what they are banks. Mm-hmm. And you put a coin on it, and you have a lever in the back, and it's like a slot machine. And it shows something really funny, but again, it's one of those objects that I think both sides, they collected and they used. This is one of my favorite spaces, I have to say. It's dedicated to the Pullman porters, who people didn't know. They were, after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, a lot of these individuals that worked on plantations and worked on farms had nowhere to go. And so there was a white gentleman by the name of George Pullman. George Pullman originated and started the Pullman porter sleeper car. And a lot of these individuals that you see in the uniforms that you see here, they worked these trains. They worked 60 to 70 hours a week, unbearable conditions, and they served as porters during the afternoons, mornings, afternoons, and even into evenings. And then in the evening, they put on a white jacket, and they served in dining cars. They put up with some of the most horrendous bigotry, discrimination, but they had the wherewithal to keep a smile on their faces. They were the first unionized African-American group of workers, and they were unionized by A. Philip Randolph, and he got them better wages, better hours. They had the company abide by strict rules and regulations. I always like to tell this story. They were all called George, right? And for the obvious reason. There was a time where they were not recognized by white passengers, and the whole cliche of knowing, as we saw in that room over here, stereotypes. And because they stated that African American men, they all look alike, so why don't we all call them George? Because we don't think we need to get to know who they are. They're just servants, and that's all they are. But the upside of this is, we all know who Jackie Gleason was. And Jackie Gleason was fearful of flying. And that was back in vaudeville, and even going forward in life, he didn't want to fly. So he would get on these sleeper car trains, and when he got on these sleeper car trains, he made it his business to know each and every one of these porters' names, their families, and took time and spent time to make them feel humanized. And they loved him. They liked working with him. And they said he was a fair and decent guy. And so I like to tell that story, even though there is it's kind of like a little shaded area where they're concerned. But that was a good point for them in life as workers. What I try to do is, as we're going through time now, we're in a segregated movie theater, right? So if you can see, we recreated the balcony where, as they were called back in the 1930s and 40s, colored, they had to sit in the balcony. So we recreated this balcony situation, and those are original movie theater seats that come from a 1930s movie house outside of Macon, Georgia. And when black folk came to the movies, they had to sit in the balcony. And there are African American people that, are my parents' age and old enough to be my grandparents, that will come into this space, and they now laugh. And the reason why they laugh is because they talk about when they were younger, how they used to have popcorn and candy, and they used to throw it over the balcony at people, but they laugh about it now. But back then, Jim Crow laws were so serious that if you even did that, you were disrespecting white people, and you could be subjected to arrest. You might be subjected to some harsh language. And I have an aunt that came through here when it opened, and she laughed about it. But then she talked about it because her girlfriends went home and told their parents, and their parents told my grandfather. My grandfather, gave her a good whipping. and told her that, you know, you're not going to be defying or you're not going to do anything that's going to be disrespectful. That may get her in trouble and may get him in trouble. In this space is, we have the original movie posters from the period of time that were playing back in those days. And also, we have snippets of 3-minute trailers of the movies that were impactful back then. Gone with the Wind, The African Queen, the Bogart movies, and things of that nature. So when people come in here, they can see what this was and what it was like. And the first thing they see is this balcony, and they stand and they look and they say, this is what this was. This space is called the Founders Hallway. So if you look at the picture there on the mantle, we found that here, even though we knew this was the Cupperwatt house. And that picture was a picture of Michael Cupperwatt. Michael Cupperwatt was the principal and educator in Bridgeport. And he's no longer here. His wife is alive. And when they came on the grand opening, the family, she was really, really emotional because we never told her we were going to be using Michael's image. And it's significant, this hallway, because it's kind of like dedicated to the Cupperwatts. They entertained foreign students. They had foreign students here that lived here for 43 years. They were involved in the educational system. And that statue there is somewhat dedicated to Michael Cupperwatt, which is Uncle Ned's school. Uncle Ned being a former slave and his niece teaching him how to read. So I thought that was a good correlation to what this space is. This space is similar to what I was just talking about in terms of putting a face on the museum, but this puts a face on a national group of young men that fought in World War II. This space is dedicated to the Tuskegee Airmen. Right here, this gentleman was from Hartford, Connecticut, Second Lieutenant Edwin Thornton Dixon, and his family were kind enough to donate his pictures to us so that we could identify him as being a true hero. Because sometimes a lot of these individuals, they were forgotten who they were, and we know who these individuals were, especially as of the last 2 weeks. The last remaining Tuskegee Airmen passed away, Brigadier General Charles McGee. And these individuals were classmates. Brings us close to home, right? Because, real quick story. So this yearbook belongs to me. Doesn't belong to the Thornton family. So every day I would come in and I would try to find I tried to learn, why is this yearbook always turned? Why is this picture always turned? And before we opened, and 3 weeks before, and I kept seeing, because this is a relative of mine that is a Tuskegee Airman, and that's his flight jacket, the flight jacket inside the closet. So every day I'd come in, and this page would be turned. And unbeknownst to me, I'd ask, why is this page turned? So one of my staff people said, because Lieutenant Dixon is right here. And I was like, who would ever thunk that? Maybe 90 years later, both these souls, my relative and he, who I'm showing in this museum, is in this yearbook. This is our civil rights room, and it speaks for itself. I mean, no civil rights space would be defined if Dr. King was not somewhere in here. And in this space, when you walk in, you'll hear Dr. King's speeches going on and getting people in the sense of what was going on as he was starting out. And we have pictures that I own that we have posted had them blown up and posted as Dr. King was walking over the Norman Pettus Bridge and along the parade route of people that congregated and waited for the march. And that was done Bloody Sunday, which was in 1965, March 1965, and then 50 years later, the President Obama had walked over the same bridge, and it was pretty poignant. And again, it speaks for itself. The water fountains, as I said, Senator, I told you that they are from the period of time where they came from, which is in the south and the southwest, of how one water fountain or drinking fountains were treated in terms of cleanliness and who used them. Students knew right away when they came through what those represented. Mm-hmm. And then we moved to there's a jar of jelly beans over here, and a lot of people say, what's the significance, right? The significance is my grandparents and my parents, when they grew up in the South, my grandparents that is, when they grew up down South, in order for them to vote, they had to guess how many of those jelly beans were in that jar. And if they did not get it right, which was impossible, nobody ever did, they were not able to vote. Okay, so the collection that we're in this space here has a lot to do with my mom, and it's cathartic to people that come through the museum and they end up in this space as they get ready to exit. And there's usually music playing from various parts of the decades, the 50s, 60s, 70s. And my mom, she collected a wider range of albums from spiritual to gospel to speeches by Dr. King, Mahalia Jackson, who was one of Dr. King's favorite gospel singers. And she had about 3,000 of these albums. And so what we did with this collection was to put it up here to show who she was and what she listened to, because when we were younger, my brother and myself, we would come home from school or later on in the evening, my mom would be playing things like Etta James or Aretha, and it would be kind of slow and solemn. And back then they were called record players or hi-fis. Right. And so as we're walking through the living room, we're hearing this music, and we look at each other and we said, okay, Daddy must have messed up somewhere. Yeah,
and depending upon what she played.
That's right, right. And so we then, figured out that this is what she did, and she was a very active person in the civil rights movement, and she worked for United States Senator Chris Dodd, as I did later on in the years, as his legislative person, eyes and ears for the city of New Haven and different parts of Connecticut. So the guitars that we see on the wall are 8 of my father's guitar, and he could not read a lick of music, didn't know what a chord was, but he was able to play anything that he heard in a 5 to 10 minute span, and we would marvel at it because we would think that when you left the room, he was part of that band or that orchestra that was playing the guitars. Yeah, I do have clothing artifacts that are from celebrities: Aretha Franklin, LeRon Bennett, James Brown, Chris Rock, Bernie Mac, Sammy Davis Jr., Aretha Franklin. So I mean, we will make this a journey, a destination where we hope that people will enjoy and feel comfortable coming here.
Stratford's very blessed to have you. This has been not only educational, it's entertaining, at least in this area, but it's provocative. And I think by learning about what has happened through history, people will be better equipped to make sure that we don't repeat that history moving forward.
Yeah. And we're really thankful for your coming here and taking the time out of your busy schedule, because it's really important. It's really important that the people that make the machine work in municipal as well as on the state level see that this is can only add to the state as well as this community of Stratford.
Yeah, it absolutely adds to the fabric of our community, and we're thankful and blessed to have someone like you who's so dedicated to this mission of bringing this information forward, and it's a wonderful resource in our landscape, and it needs to be there. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.